Miguel was just trying to get home after a long day, hands calloused from work, pockets nearly empty, dreaming of a better life that always seemed just out of reach. The streets were quiet but not safe. Shadows clung to the corners, and every passing car felt like a small threat. Then came Bryan. Bryan, a man in a sharp suit, expensive watch glinting under the streetlights. At first, he looked like just another passerby, but in a heartbeat, that image shattered. Without warning, Bryan lunged at Miguel, striking him brutally, over something so small, so insignificant it didn't even matter. People screamed. Phones came out, but no one stepped in fast enough. Miguel crumpled to the ground, pain shooting through his body, his life flashing in fragments. Why would a stranger, someone clearly with money, with power, attack a man like Miguel with such rage? The answer wasn't just shocking, it was unimaginable. What started as a random, terrifying act of violence would soon unravel into a story that shook a city and exposed the dark side of privilege. Miguel, bleeding and struggling to breathe, wasn't who Bryan thought he was. What no one on the street knew, and what Bryan would soon discover in the most humiliating, life-altering way, was that Miguel wasn't just an ordinary man. Behind that worn jacket, behind those tired eyes, was a man trained for resilience, a man with a past that few could imagine. Miguel was military, disciplined, tough, and trained to survive situations far worse than a street attack. Bryan, arrogant and confident, thought his money and status made him untouchable. He didn't count on Miguel fighting back, not with anger, but with precision. And when the truth about Bryan's identity and Miguel's background came to light, the shock didn't stop at the street corner. It went viral. The world watched in disbelief as a billionaire CEO, someone who had everything, was brought down not by law, not immediately by authorities, but by the courage and skill of the man he underestimated. Soon after, the law caught up. Cameras, witnesses, and outrage converged. Bryan was arrested. Headlines screamed. Social media exploded. People couldn't stop talking about it. A powerful man humiliated, a poor man standing strong. A story that revealed the thin line between arrogance and accountability. But the question lingers. How could someone with all the power in the world let their anger spiral into something so reckless? And how did Miguel survive what should have been a life-changing, possibly life-ending encounter? Stay with us, because the full story, how Miguel's past intersected with Bryan's greed, the shocking confrontation, and the moment the billionaire fell, will leave you stunned. This isn't just a story about wealth and violence. It's about courage, justice, and the truth that no amount of money can ever hide who you really are. Miguel woke up before dawn, the cold air of his small apartment biting at his skin. The walls were thin, the floor creaking under each step, and the aroma of burnt coffee lingering from last night's attempt at breakfast. Life wasn't easy, but Miguel had learned to make the most of what little he had. His job at the local warehouse kept him busy, his muscles tired at the end of each day. Yet there was a quiet pride in the work he did. Every package he lifted, every box he sorted, was a small victory, proof that he could survive, and maybe, one day, thrive. Miguel's neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it had character. Kids ran in the streets after school, their laughter bouncing off brick walls scarred with graffiti. Old men sat on benches, playing chess, arguing over moves they'd made 100 times before. The smell of street food mixed with car exhaust in the early morning air, creating a rhythm Miguel had grown accustomed to. This was home. This was his life, humble but real. He had friends, a tight-knit group who understood struggle because they lived it too. They shared stories, dreams, and frustrations over chipped coffee mugs and second-hand chairs. But despite the camaraderie, Miguel had learned early on that the world outside their streets often viewed him differently, less than invisible or worse, a target. Small injustices piled up over the years. People crossing the street to avoid him, store clerks questioning his honesty, whispers in crowded rooms that froze him in place. None of it was violent, yet Miguel's routine was simple. Work, save, survive, repeat. On weekends, he practiced his own kind of discipline, jogging along cracked sidewalks, perfecting his posture, and remembering lessons from his past military training. Few knew he had served, that he had faced dangers far beyond this city's quiet streets. That part of his life stayed hidden. It was a shield, a quiet strength beneath a world that didn't see him as strong, only as poor. But hints of what was to come had already begun. The way people looked at him as he walked down the street, some with pity, some with suspicion, was a silent signal. The news headlines about escalating tensions in the city, about violent encounters and social divisions, whispered that nothing could be taken for granted. Even in his neighborhood, subtle prejudices shaped interactions. A hesitant nod, a door held too briefly, a laughter that didn't include him. Miguel felt it in the air, a tension that wasn't loud but undeniable, pressing against his chest like the summer humidity. One afternoon, as he walked home carrying a heavy crate of goods, Miguel noticed a sleek black SUV slowing down near him. The driver's expression was sharp, dismissive, almost mocking. He felt a knot in his stomach tighten, a premonition he couldn't ignore. The streets were familiar, but suddenly the familiar felt unsafe. And though Miguel didn't know it yet, this encounter would change everything, bringing the invisible prejudice he'd sensed into terrifying, unavoidable reality. Despite the tension, Miguel moved forward with quiet resilience. He had survived worse, he reminded himself. But the city had a way of testing limits, and the stage was being set for a confrontation that would push him beyond what anyone, including him, could predict. Miguel's life had always been a careful balancing act: work, home, discipline, and survival. But that balance shattered the day Bryan's black SUV slowed beside him on the cracked city sidewalk. The moment felt surreal. Bryan's eyes glinted with a mix of impatience and contempt, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Miguel instinctively stepped aside, carrying the crate he had just picked up from the warehouse. But Bryan didn't just pass. He slammed his car door, blocking Miguel's path. "You think you belong here?" Bryan sneered, voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. Miguel's chest tightened, his knuckles gripping the crate. He knew he had a choice: escalate or retreat. But before he could respond, Bryan shoved him roughly, sending him stumbling across the pavement. The crate tumbled, spilling packages onto the ground. People around whispered, some pointing, others pretending not to notice. Miguel's heart pounded, not from fear of pain, but from the helplessness of being judged instantly because of the color of his skin. It wasn't the first time he'd felt it, but it was the first time it came with blatant, violent intent. Bryan laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the air. "Pathetic," he spat. "This is why people like you stay on the bottom." Miguel's military training surged to the forefront. His body tensed, ready for confrontation, but his mind calculated the stakes. He was alone, outnumbered by the indifferent city, facing someone whose wealth made him untouchable. Or so he thought. The first punch came before Miguel could react. Bryan swung with brute force, fueled by arrogance and entitlement. Pain exploded across Miguel's face as he fell to the ground. Onlookers gasped, some frozen with shock, others filming the attack on their phones. The sound of fists hitting flesh echoed in the narrow street. Miguel's vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He had survived combat. This would be no different, but he needed to turn the tables, fast. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another swing. His military training guided him, a dance of defensive movements and calculated counterattacks. He ducked, twisted, and for the first time, used Bryan's momentum against him, sending him stumbling into the side of his own car. Bryan's smirk faltered, replaced by disbelief. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Miguel was not just a man fighting for his life. He was now the target of public scrutiny. Someone shouted, "Call the cops!" Another said, "That guy's rich, don't mess with him." Social media posts went live in real time, videos uploaded and comments poured in, some sympathetic, others cruelly dismissive. The disparity was clear. Wealth provided power, but the world was about to show that arrogance has limits. As Miguel regained his footing, Bryan lunged again, but this time, hesitation crept into his movements. People were now surrounding them, phones recording every strike, every dodge, every reaction. Miguel's patience and strategy began to outweigh Bryan's reckless aggression. Each strike Bryan threw carried not just rage, but pride. Pride that would soon become his undoing. Just when it seemed like Miguel might be overwhelmed, a neighbor stepped forward. A woman with a phone pressed against her face, capturing evidence that would later go viral. Her voice cut through the chaos. "Stop! He's not just some random guy. He's military trained." Bryan froze, and for the first time, the tables turned psychologically. The arrogance in his eyes wavered. He had underestimated Miguel completely. He was no ordinary man. He was disciplined, strong, and no longer intimidated by wealth or social status. Miguel didn't stop. With careful precision, he deflected another punch and forced Bryan off balance. Each move was controlled, calculated. And then, finally, the moment of reckoning, Bryan, flustered, tripped over the curb, sprawling onto the asphalt. The crowd gasped, some cheering silently, others still recording, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. But the tension wasn't over. Miguel knew Bryan wasn't finished. He saw the simmering anger, the desperation to maintain dominance, to save face in front of everyone watching. The next move would define the outcome. Would Miguel walk away, or would Bryan's unchecked arrogance spark an even worse escalation? The streets were tense, the air thick with anticipation. Onlookers held their breath, cameras focused, every second stretching longer than the last. And then, sirens wailed in the distance. The law was coming. Miguel stood battered but resolute, while Bryan scrambled to his feet, realizing that this encounter, so carefully controlled by wealth and privilege until now, had finally met its reckoning. Even as the police cars approached, Miguel's mind raced, not with fear but with clarity. The world had seen his strength, his courage, and the injustice he endured. And while the fight wasn't over, the first victory had been claimed. Bryan's arrogance had met a wall he hadn't anticipated. Truth, skill, and undeniable humanity. The air was thick with tension, every heartbeat amplified in Miguel's ears. Bryan's arrogance had met resistance, but now desperation flickered in his eyes. He lunged again, this time with raw, unrestrained fury. His expensive watch gleamed under the harsh streetlights as he swung, each punch carrying the weight of entitlement and prejudice. The crowd recoiled, some stepping back, others frozen in disbelief. Cameras captured every detail, the bruises forming on Miguel's face, the dirt in his hair, the sweat and fury radiating from both men. Miguel's training kicked in. Years in the military had taught him one thing above all: control your fear, anticipate your opponent, and use their momentum against them. He dodged Bryan's strike, letting the billionaire's weight propel him past. Bryan stumbled, cursing, rage twisting his features. This wasn't just a street fight anymore. It was a collision of worlds. Wealth versus survival, arrogance versus courage, privilege versus lived experience. Miguel's breathing was steady, his movements precise. He had no intention of letting Bryan's violence define him, but he couldn't simply walk away either, not when the humiliation, the threat, and the injustice were so public. He feinted left, then struck, pushing Bryan against the hood of the SUV. Bryan grunted, shocked at Miguel's audacity. The people filming gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. He's military. He knows what he's doing, but Bryan wasn't done. With a snarl, he swung wildly, fueled by the desperation of a man who thought money and status made him untouchable. Miguel absorbed the blow, winced, and then countered with swift precision, forcing Bryan to stagger back. Every movement Miguel made was deliberate, controlled, a stark contrast to Bryan's chaotic flailing. The streets echoed with the sound of confrontation, the shouting of bystanders, the click of phones recording history in real time. Suddenly, Bryan tried to make a run for it. His pride couldn't allow him to lose in front of everyone, but Miguel anticipated it. With a few calculated steps, he intercepted Bryan, pressing him against the vehicle again. The crowd leaned in, the atmosphere charged. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavier than the last. Miguel locked eyes with Bryan, and in that instant, the power dynamic flipped completely. The wealthy man, so used to dominating, so used to being untouchable, was now cornered, not by the law yet, but by raw, undeniable truth. "You think money gives you the right to hurt people?" Miguel said, voice low but unwavering. The words carried more weight than any punch. You think your wealth protects you from accountability? You've underestimated the wrong man. Bryan's face twisted with fury and fear. He lunged one last time, but Miguel sidestepped, using Bryan's momentum to throw him off balance. Bryan fell hard onto the asphalt, the impact echoing through the narrow street. Bystanders gasped. Someone yelled for the police. The moment felt cinematic. A wealthy man, humiliated, sprawled on the ground, facing a man society had overlooked for too long. Then, sirens pierced the air. Police cars skidded to a stop, red and blue lights flashing, reflecting in puddles on the asphalt. Officers jumped out, restraining Bryan, whose protests fell on deaf ears. The cameras captured it all: the arrest, the stunned faces, the crowd buzzing with disbelief. Bryan, the billionaire, the untouchable, was finally being held accountable in a way he could never control. Miguel stood, battered and bruised but upright. His chest heaved, sweat and blood mixing on his skin. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or judged by their skin color or socioeconomic status. And in that moment, the world could see that courage, skill, and dignity were more powerful than wealth and arrogance. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some cheering quietly, others still capturing the aftermath on their phones. Miguel allowed himself a moment of relief, but he knew this wasn't the end. The legal system, the media, and public opinion would continue to play out in ways he couldn't fully control. What mattered now was that the scales had shifted, even if only slightly. Bryan had lost his untouchable aura, and Miguel had shown that power could be challenged in the most human of ways, with courage, intelligence, and restraint. As officers led Bryan away, Miguel whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "No one gets to decide my worth. Not money, not fear, not hate." And with that, the climax ended. Not with a quiet resolution, but with a promise. Justice was coming, and Miguel's story was only beginning. The sirens had faded, but the echoes of that violent confrontation lingered in the air. Bryan was in custody, cuffed and shouting at officers who ignored his protests. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring about what they had just witnessed. For Miguel, the battle wasn't just physical, it had been symbolic. He had faced someone society had long told him was untouchable and proved that courage, skill, and dignity could topple even the tallest towers of arrogance. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with news coverage and social media chatter. Video clips of the confrontation went viral almost instantly. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire CEO arrested after street fight with former soldier. Wealth versus courage. The moment a man stood up to arrogance." Miguel's identity, once hidden behind the veil of humility and struggle, became public. People were captivated not just by the fight, but by the story of a man who had been underestimated his whole life. Miguel returned to his modest apartment, nursing bruises and sore muscles, but he carried something more important, a renewed sense of purpose. The physical scars would fade, but the confidence that came from standing tall in the face of violence and prejudice was permanent. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers reached out to him, offering support, congratulations, and admiration. For the first time in years, Miguel felt seen, not for his background, his skin, or his income, but for who he truly was. Bryan, on the other hand, faced consequences that even his wealth couldn't dodge. Legal proceedings were swift, given the overwhelming video evidence. The courts were packed, the media swarming. The case became more than a legal matter. It became a symbol of accountability. People from across the city and beyond followed each development. The arraignment, the testimonies, the heated courtroom exchanges. The arrogance that had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions had crumbled. Bryan's name became synonymous with a cautionary tale. Money could not erase wrongdoing, and prejudice carried consequences. But the story didn't end there. Miguel's experience sparked broader conversations about systemic racism, social inequality, and the way society treats those who are often overlooked. Community leaders used the incident as a catalyst for awareness campaigns. Schools, local organizations, and media outlets discussed the importance of empathy, equality, and justice. Miguel was invited to speak at community events, his military background and street-honed resilience serving as inspiration. His courage became a symbol, The fight wasn't just about him, it was about challenging a system that perpetuated prejudice and inequality. As the legal process unfolded, Bryan faced not just criminal charges but public scrutiny that affected his company, his reputation, and his standing in the business world. Investors hesitated, employees whispered, and the public demanded accountability. It was a vivid lesson. Wealth and privilege offered protection in theory, but in practice, the truth had a way of catching up. For Miguel, watching this unfold was bittersweet. He didn't seek revenge, but he had witnessed a rare justice, the arrogant finally being held responsible for their actions. Meanwhile, Miguel focused on healing, both physical and emotional. He reconnected with friends and family, cherishing relationships that reminded him why resilience mattered. He also took steps to share his story more widely, using it to educate others about the dangers of unchecked prejudice and the power of courage. Interviews, podcasts, and social media posts allowed him to amplify the lessons he had learned on that street, showing that individual bravery could spark collective awareness. Over time, the city itself felt a subtle shift. People were more mindful of each other, more willing to intervene, to speak out against harassment and injustice. Miguel's fight had become a metaphorical turning point, a reminder that unity, courage, and moral action could challenge systemic wrongs. Racism and prejudice had not disappeared, but the conversation had changed. A single moment, captured in real time, had sparked reflection and, ultimately, progress. The final lesson settled in Miguel's heart. The world would never be perfect. But he could define how he responded to injustice. Courage didn't require wealth, status, or recognition. It required conviction. Empathy and justice were more powerful than privilege and hate. He realized that while the fight had been personal, its impact was universal. The streets where he had once walked cautiously now seemed less intimidating, filled with possibility. He had survived, yes, but he had also transformed the way people saw him, and, in some small way, the way they saw the world. On the day Bryan was sentenced, Miguel watched from afar, a quiet satisfaction in his chest. Justice had been served, not just legally but morally. Bryan's fall from arrogance served as a reminder to everyone that cruelty and prejudice could not remain hidden forever. Miguel whispered softly to himself, "Courage defeats hate. Prejudice never wins, and the truth, no matter how long it waits, always finds its way." It was a moment of closure, yet also a beginning. Miguel's life, once defined by struggle and invisibility, was now defined by resilience, integrity, and impact. His story would continue to inspire, reminding everyone that even in the darkest moments, courage, unity, and justice could prevail.